Before we reveal how Daniel's revolutionary design spread across 3 territories and changed frontier architecture forever, let us know in the comments, have you ever had an idea that others mocked, only to be proven right later? And if this story of turning doubt into triumph inspires you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because tomorrow's episode reveals another incredible tale of frontier innovation born from desperation. The story of a blacksmith who solved the unsolvable problem that had stumped engineers for decades. Daniel Webb's earth-sheltered home stood for 73 years before being carefully preserved as a historical site. But the real legacy was not the structure itself. By 1885, over 2,000 earth-sheltered dwellings had been built across the northern frontier, all based on principles Daniel had combined from Ojibwe wisdom and engineering science. His book went through 12 editions and was translated into German, Swedish, and Norwegian for immigrant communities. But here is what history books rarely mention. Daniel was not the only frontier innovator whose unconventional thinking saved lives while facing ridicule. Tomorrow, we bring you the story of Emma Blackwood, a blacksmith's daughter who designed a revolutionary water pump system that everyone said was impossible, until the drought of 1876 proved she had been right all along. Her story involves sabotage, redemption, and a design so brilliant that versions of it are still in use today. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. Until then, remember, sometimes the most foolish-looking idea is simply the solution that nobody else had the courage to imagine. The morning after the Great Blizzard of 1868 revealed a landscape of death and impossible survival. When neighbors finally pushed through chest-deep snow to check on the young stranger and his dog, they expected to find his peculiar hillside, dwelling buried and collapsed. Instead, they found Daniel standing at his doorway, his wolf dog Ash beside him, beneath a structure that defied everything they thought they knew about frontier building. Thomas Garrett stood at his cabin door, looking across the valley toward where his neighbors' homesteads should be visible. He saw nothing but white. 3 days of blizzard had transformed the Wisconsin frontier into something unrecognizable. His wife Mary appeared beside him, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Their cabin had survived, barely. "We need to check on that strange boy," Mary said quietly. Daniel Webb, the outsider who had dug his home into the hillside like some kind of animal, lived a quarter-mile east. The community had whispered about his chances of surviving the winter in such a foolish dwelling. Thomas nodded and began the brutal work of digging a path. The snow reached his chest in places. It took him nearly an hour to travel what normally required 5 minutes of walking. As he crested the small rise that overlooked Daniel's property, he stopped so suddenly that he nearly fell. The hillside dwelling was not only standing, it appeared completely untouched. While every other cabin in the valley bore massive snow loads on their roofs, Daniel's half-buried structure showed almost no accumulation. The hill itself had caught and held the snow above and behind the cabin. The earth-sheltered design meant snow simply could not pile on the roof the way it devastated conventional structures. Thomas had watched Daniel building this contraption throughout the previous summer and fall. The entire community had laughed about it. Digging his own grave, they called it. A waste of good labor and peculiar madness. Some suggested loneliness had affected his mind. Now, as Thomas struggled through snow that had killed families across the valley, he stared at Daniel's impossible structure still standing strong. He heard a door open. Daniel appeared on his stone. Steps, Ash visible behind him in the warm glow of their fireplace. He looked tired, but calm. "Thomas," Daniel called across the snow, "is your family well?" Thomas could not immediately answer. He was trying to understand what he was seeing. The logic of it seemed wrong. Every cabin built by experienced men had struggled or failed, yet this boy's strange burrow stood untouched. "The Johnsons," Thomas finally managed. "Have you seen them?" Daniel's face fell. He shook his head slowly. Thomas knew what that expression meant before Daniel spoke. "Their roof went in the second night," Daniel said quietly. Daniel Webb had arrived in the settlement in spring of 1867. A solitary figure of 23 years, with a wolf dog at his side and knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere, the community understood. He owned 160 acres of Wisconsin forest, a small sum of money, basic tools, and Ash, the gray wolf dog who never left his side. The community expected him to build like everyone else, a log cabin on flat ground, walls perpendicular to earth, roof angled to shed rain. That was how frontier homesteads were constructed. That was how civilization pushed into wilderness. But Daniel had different plans, shaped by experiences the settlers could not fathom. His father had been a surveyor who worked extensively with railroad companies, plotting routes through mountains and difficult terrain. Daniel had spent his childhood watching engineers solve problems of grade, drainage, and earth movement. More significantly, he had spent 2 years living with Ojibwe communities in northern Michigan, learning how indigenous peoples had survived brutal winters for generations. The Ojibwe taught him that fighting nature was foolish, working with landscape, understanding how earth itself provided insulation and protection, recognizing that the best shelter sometimes meant going into the ground rather than standing above it. These lessons had saved lives for centuries, but white settlers dismissed such knowledge as primitive. Daniel's father had died when Daniel was 20, killed in a surveying accident when unstable ground gave way beneath him. His mother had passed years earlier from fever. Daniel found himself alone with inheritance money and knowledge that bridged two worlds, engineering principles from his father and environmental wisdom from the Ojibwe. He had purchased his Wisconsin land specifically for its hillside. While other homesteaders sought flat, easily cleared ground, Daniel wanted slope and southern exposure. The community thought this strange from the beginning. At the settlement's general store, Henrik Hansen had asked him directly, "Why do you want hillside land? Makes everything harder." Plowing, building, even walking, Daniel had tried to explain. The hill provides protection. Earth insulates. If I build into the slope rather than on top of it, the land itself becomes part of my shelter. Henrik had laughed, not unkindly, but with the dismissive certainty of someone who knew how things were done. "Boy, we build cabins above ground for good reason. You dig into earth, you get flooding, cave-ins, dampness. You will regret this foolishness." Other settlers were less polite. John Peterson, a widower with 4 children, told anyone who would listen that the strange newcomer with his Indian ideas would not survive his first winter. "Mark my words, that boy will be begging for help come January if he lives that long." Daniel stood in the settlement's church on the first Sunday of June, 1867, and announced his building plans to the assembled community. He believed in being forthright about his intentions, thinking that explanation might prevent misunderstanding. He was wrong. "I will be building my home into the hillside on my property," he said clearly. "The structure will be partially underground, with earth bermed against 3 walls, and the southern face open for light and access." The silence that followed was broken by scattered laughter. Then the questions began, each one dripping with skepticism. "You mean to dig a hole and live in it like a rabbit?" asked Mary Garrett, her tone mixing concern with derision. "Not a hole," Daniel explained patiently. "An earth-sheltered dwelling. The hill will be excavated carefully, with stone retaining walls built to hold back earth. The roof will be supported by timber beams, then covered with soil and sod. The earth itself provides insulation that wood alone cannot match." Thomas Garrett shook his head. "That is not how homes are built. You will have water problems, structural failures, darkness. This is madness." Daniel tried again. "Indigenous peoples have used earth-sheltered designs for centuries in harsh climates." "The Ojibwe Indian houses," John Peterson interrupted, his voice hard. "You want to live like a savage. That is what you are saying." "I am saying that people who have survived these winters For generations might know something about building that we could learn from, Daniel replied, feeling his patience strain, combined with proper engineering for drainage and structural support. Earth shelter design offers advantages that conventional cabins cannot provide. Henrik Hansen stood up, his expression troubled. Daniel, I mean no disrespect, but you are young and inexperienced. Building a proper cabin is hard enough. What you describe is digging your own grave. The earth will collapse on you, or water will flood you out, or you will freeze in the darkness. Please reconsider this foolishness. I have made my decision, Daniel said quietly. I wanted to inform the community out of courtesy, not to seek permission or approval. The meeting dissolved into murmured conversations about the strange young man's certain doom. As Daniel left with Ash at his side, he heard the whispers clearly. They were meant to be heard. Give him until first snow, someone said. He will come, crawling back to civilization, begging for help, building a real cabin. Daniel kept walking, his jaw set with determination. Daniel began excavation on the 10th of June, starting before dawn when air was cool and his energy was fresh. Ash sat on the hillside above, watching as Daniel marked out the dimensions with stakes and string, 20 feet wide, 16 feet deep into the hill, with ceiling height of 9 feet at the front, sloping to 7 feet at the back. The digging was brutal work. Daniel used a pickaxe to break through root systems and rocky soil, then shoveled the loosened earth into a wheelbarrow he had built specifically for this purpose. Each day he moved hundreds of pounds of soil, his hands blistering despite gloves, his back screaming protest. But he was not simply digging a hole. He was creating a precise excavation with specific angles for drainage, careful attention to load-bearing earth above, and constant measurement to ensure walls remained plumb and pool. Dimensions stayed true. His father's surveying lessons proved invaluable. Understanding grade and water flow meant the difference between a dry dwelling and a flooded disaster. By the end of the first week, he had excavated 3 feet into the hillside. The community watched with morbid curiosity. Several neighbors stopped by, ostensibly to check on his welfare, but really to witness his foolishness firsthand. John Peterson arrived on the 8th day, watching Daniel work for several minutes before speaking. You are killing yourself for nothing. This will never work. Daniel straightened, wiping sweat from his face. It will work because the principles are sound. Earth provides insulation value far beyond wood. The hillside itself will bear snow load that would crush a conventional roof. Drainage channels I am cutting will direct water away from the structure. Principles, John snorted. I know reality. Earth collapses, water floods. You are wasting your strength. But Daniel kept at digging. He worked 10 hours daily, sometimes 12. Ash brought him water in a leather pouch Daniel had rigged for the dog to carry. At night he slept in a small tent, his muscles aching, his mind calculating the next day's work. The second week brought the most critical phase, cutting the drainage channels. These trenches, positioned above and around his excavation, would catch water from rain and snow melt and direct it away from his dwelling. Too shallow, and they would fail. Too steep, and they would erode. Daniel calculated grades carefully, checking his work repeatedly. By mid-July, Daniel's excavation was complete, and the real construction began. He had carved a space into the hillside that measured 20 feet wide, 16 feet deep, and 9 feet high at the entrance. Now came the crucial work, building retaining walls that would hold back thousands of pounds of earth while creating a livable space. He began laying stone, work that required both strength and precision. Each stone needed to be positioned to transfer weight downward and outward, creating a wall that would stand for decades. Daniel had learned stone masonry from an old Ojibwe builder who understood how rock could be fitted together with minimal mortar, using the stone's own weight and shape to create stability. The work went slowly. Some days he laid only 3 feet of wall, carefully selecting each stone, checking plumb and level, ensuring every piece contributed to overall structural integrity. Ash lay nearby, occasionally wandering off to hunt, but always returning before dark. Jakob Müller appeared one afternoon in late July, the 71-year-old German carpenter who had homesteaded nearby for 20 years. He stood watching Daniel work for a long time before speaking. "You know what you are doing," Jakob said finally. It was not a question. "I hope so," Daniel replied, settling another stone into place. "This is not hope. This is knowledge." "Where did you learn stonework? Like this?" Daniel explained about the Ojibwe builder, about his father's engineering background, about combining indigenous wisdom with structural principles. Jakob listened carefully, nodding occasionally. "I help you with timber work when you reach that stage," Jakob announced. "These idiots in settlement talk and talk. I prefer to see what you actually build. Also, my wife insists I bring you stew." He held up a covered pot. Over the following weeks, Jacob became Daniel's occasional assistant and frequent advisor. When Daniel began installing the heavy timber beams that would support his roof, Jacob's carpentry expertise proved invaluable. They worked together to position beams precisely, creating a framework strong enough to bear the weight of earth and sod that would cover them. "The settlement thinks you are crazy," Jacob mentioned one afternoon, as they fitted a beam into place. "I know," Daniel replied. "Good. Crazy people sometimes see things others miss. Sometimes they survive, when sensible people die." Neither man knew how prophetic those words would prove. By early September of 1867, Daniel's earth-sheltered home was complete. The structure looked nothing like conventional frontier cabins. 3 walls were solid stone, holding back the hillside earth. The southern face featured a timber frame with a heavy wooden door and 2 windows that Daniel had purchased from Hanson's mill at considerable expense. The roof was the most unusual element. Heavy timber beams spanned the 20-foot width, supported by the stone walls and 2 interior posts hewn from oak. Across these beams, Daniel had laid smaller crossbeams, then planking, then waterproof canvas he had treated with pine tar, and, finally, 18 inches of earth topped with sod he had carefully transplanted from the hillside. From a distance, the dwelling almost disappeared into the landscape. Only the southern face was visible, looking like a strange stone entrance built into the hill. The roof blended seamlessly with the slope above it, grass and wildflowers growing as if the structure did not exist. The community's reaction ranged from bewilderment to outright mockery. At church, the Sunday after completion, Daniel overheard conversations clearly meant for his ears. "Living in a dirt cave with a dog," one woman whispered loudly. "It is unnatural." "Give him 1 winter," Thomas Garrett said to a group of men. "The first time water seeps through that roof, or cold penetrates those walls, he will understand why we build proper cabins." Henrik Hansen approached Daniel directly after services. "I sold you good timber and glass for that project, but I must tell you, I believe you have built yourself a very expensive tomb. When you realize your mistake, come see me about purchasing materials for a real cabin. I will give you fair price despite this waste." Daniel thanked him politely but said nothing more. Words would not convince anyone. Only winter would prove whether his design worked. The first test came in late October, when an early snow fell, dropping 6 inches overnight. Daniel woke to find his interior temperature remarkably stable. While neighbors rushed to build fires against the cold, his dwelling retained warmth from the previous day. The earth surrounding and covering his home acted as thermal mass, slowly releasing stored heat. More importantly, the snow on his roof simply became part of the landscape. There was no dangerous accumulation, no weight bearing down on vulnerable timbers. The hill absorbed it all. Jakob visited that afternoon, examining the snow situation with keen eyes. "It works," he said simply. "They will not believe until they see real winter, but it works." December of 1868 brought omens that worried the settlement's oldest residents. The cold arrived early and intense. ice formed on the creek by the 10th of the month, 2 weeks earlier than normal. Animals behaved strangely. Deer congregated in larger herds than usual. Squirrels gathered food with unusual urgency. Birds that normally lingered into winter departed early for southern territories. Old Hans Bergstrom, who had lived in Wisconsin for 43 years, mentioned to anyone who would listen that the signs reminded him of the winter of 1843. That year had brought blizzards that killed livestock, collapsed buildings, and left homesteaders isolated for weeks. Settlers still spoke of that winter in hushed tones. Daniel heard these warnings and intensified his preparations. He stocked firewood in the protected alcove outside his door, stacking it carefully where it would stay dry. He purchased additional supplies from the general store: salt, flour, dried beans, coffee. He slaughtered it and preserved meat, hanging it in the cool interior of his dwelling where steady temperature kept it fresh. Ash seemed to sense the coming severity as well. The wolf dog stayed closer to home, hunting less frequently, as if conserving energy for trials ahead. The settlement watched Daniel's preparations with mixed feelings. Some admitted privately that his strange dwelling seemed functional, at least for autumn conditions. Others remained convinced that true winter would expose fatal flaws in his design. John Peterson stopped by in mid-December, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but really to satisfy his curiosity. Daniel invited him inside, and Peterson's expression shifted from skepticism to surprise as he entered. The interior was warm, dry, and surprisingly bright. Sunlight streamed through the southern windows, illuminating stone walls and timber ceiling. A small stove provided heat, but the dwelling required far less fuel than conventional cabins. The thick earth walls and roof held temperature steady, moderating extremes. "It is warmer than my cabin," Peterson admitted reluctantly, "and you are burning less wood." "Earth insulation," Daniel explained. "The ground temperature 6 feet down stays relatively constant year-round, around 45 to 50 degrees. My walls are surrounded by that earth. It takes much less fuel to heat from 50 degrees to 70 than from 20 degrees to 70. Peterson shook his head slowly. "Your Indian science, I still do not trust it, but I admit it is warmer than I expected." That night, temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Daniel slept comfortably while neighbors burned through firewood at alarming rates, fighting cold that penetrated log walls with brutal efficiency. The storm arrived on January 3, 1869, preceded by an eerie calm that made experienced settlers nervous. The barometric pressure dropped dramatically. The air became absolutely still. Animals disappeared into whatever shelter they could find. Daniel brought extra firewood inside, filled every container with water, and checked his supplies one final time. Ash paced near the door, whining softly. The wolf dog sensed what was coming. At sunset, the first snowflakes began falling. Within an hour, it was a blizzard unlike anything the settlement had experienced in a generation. Wind howled across the valley with devastating force. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to nothing. Temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Daniel stood at his southern windows watching the storm rage. He could see nothing beyond the glass except white chaos. But inside his earth-sheltered dwelling, conditions remained remarkably stable. The wind screamed past his entrance but could not penetrate the thick walls. The temperature dropped slightly but held steady around 60 degrees with minimal fire. The hill itself acted as a windbreak. Storm winds struck the slope above his dwelling and deflected upward, creating a pocket of relative calm at his entrance. Snow accumulated on the hillside, but the mass of earth between Daniel and the storm absorbed its fury. His conventional roof would have been catastrophic in these conditions. The weight of accumulating snow, the force of wind against exposed surfaces, the cold penetrating through inadequate insulation. But Daniel had no conventional roof. The hill was his roof. and the hill could bear infinite weight. Through the first night, the storm intensified. Daniel lay on his sleeping platform, Ash curled beside him, listening to wind rage outside while his dwelling remained calm. He thought of his neighbors in their log cabins, fighting to keep fires burning, listening to timbers groan under increasing snow loads, wondering if their roofs would hold. The second day brought no relief. If anything, the storm worsened. Snow fell in amounts that seemed impossible. Wind velocities increased until the sound became a constant roar. Daniel ventured to his door once, opened it briefly, and was struck by a wall of wind and snow so powerful he immediately pushed it closed again. He was sealed in, but he was safe. His food would last weeks. His water supply was adequate. His firewood could burn for days. The earth around him held steady temperature, while outside, the frontier winter killed anything exposed to its fury. The second night, Daniel heard distant crashes, muffled but unmistakable. The crashes Daniel heard on the second night were the sounds of death. Somewhere in the settlement, roofs were collapsing under snow loads that exceeded their structural capacity. Each crash represented catastrophic failure, and in frontier cabins, roof collapse meant families trapped beneath tons of timber and snow. Daniel stood at his door, listening to the terrible sounds carried on screaming wind, and felt helpless rage at his inability to help. The storm was too severe. Visibility was zero. Temperature would kill an exposed person in minutes. He could do nothing but wait and hope his neighbors had somehow survived. The third day brought continued blizzard. Daniel had never experienced weather this relentless. 3 full days of sustained wind and snowfall seemed beyond nature's capacity, yet it continued. He maintained his fire, rationed his supplies carefully, and kept Ash calm, as the wolf dog paced nervously, sensing disaster beyond their protected walls. Inside the earth-sheltered dwelling, conditions remained stable. The temperature held steady. The air stayed dry. The structure gave no indication of stress or failure. Outside, snow piled on the hillside above Daniel's home in massive quantities, but the earth absorbed it all. There was no roof to collapse because the roof was the hill itself, and the hill was indifferent to snow weight. Daniel thought constantly about his neighbors. Were they alive? Had their cabins held? He knew the answer would be grim. He had warned them, not with words, but with his design. He had shown them an alternative approach. But frontier culture resisted change, especially change that came from indigenous knowledge or challenged conventional masculinity. Building into the earth seemed cowardly to men who believed strength meant standing tall above the landscape. Daniel's survival strategy appeared weak because it acknowledged limitations rather than fighting nature with brute force. But brute force could not defeat a blizzard of this magnitude. The wind finally began diminishing on the evening of the third day. By dawn of January 6th, the storm had passed, leaving behind silence more profound than the roar that had preceded it. Daniel opened his door carefully, uncertain what he would find. The world had been transformed into something alien. Snow had buried everything. Drifts rose higher than a man's head in places. The familiar landscape was gone, replaced by an undulating white desert. Trees were buried to their lower branches. Structures were invisible beneath snow. Daniel looked toward the valley where his neighbors' cabins should be visible. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Several structures had collapsed completely. Daniel stood in the doorway of his earth-sheltered home, Ash beside him, staring at the devastation the blizzard had left across the settlement. The morning sun reflected off endless white, painfully bright. In the distance he could see dark shapes where cabins had collapsed, roofs caved inward under snow weight that had exceeded what frontier construction could bear. He needed to check on survivors, but the snow was chest-deep in places. Movement would be exhausting and dangerous. Daniel began the brutal work of creating a path, using a shovel to dig through packed snow, one step at a time. It took him nearly 2 hours to reach Thomas Garrett's cabin. The structure stood, but barely. The roof sagged dangerously in the center, and Thomas was outside attempting to shovel snow from the compromised section, a dangerous and likely futile effort. "Thomas," Daniel called, "is your family safe?" Thomas turned, his face gray with exhaustion and grief. "We survived. Barely. But the Johnsons are dead. All 5 of them. Their roof collapsed the second night." His voice broke slightly. "I could hear it fall, but I could not reach them through the storm." Daniel felt cold that had nothing to do with January temperature. The Johnsons had 3 children, the youngest only 4 years old. "Who else?" Daniel asked quietly. "The Andersons, the Schmidt family. Maybe others we have not reached yet." Thomas looked at Daniel's dwelling, still mostly invisible against the hillside, completely undamaged. "Your place stood. The earth bore the weight. The hill protected the structure." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "We mocked you, called you foolish, said you were living like an animal." He paused. "You were right. We were wrong. Our conventional wisdom killed our neighbors." Over the following days, as survivors dug through snow to reach isolated homesteads, the full scope of the catastrophe became clear. 13 people had died across the settlement, some from roof collapses, others from cold exposure, when damaged cabins lost heat. The Great Blizzard of 1869 had devastated a community that thought it knew how to survive frontier winters. Daniel helped where he could, digging paths, sharing supplies, offering shelter. His earth-sheltered home, mocked as foolish just months earlier, now stood as proof that different approaches to survival deserved consideration rather than dismissal. Jacob Mueller arrived on January 8th, struggling through snow. He looked at Daniel's untouched dwelling and said simply, "Now they will listen." The settlement held a mass burial on January 15th. The ground was frozen solid, so men worked in shifts for 3 days to dig graves deep enough. Daniel attended with Ash, standing among survivors who looked at him with expressions ranging from grief to something uncomfortably close to resentment. He understood that resentment, his unconventional structure, had saved him while their traditional cabins had killed their families. Some people would always wonder if this strange outsider with his Indian ideas could build something that survived. Why had their husbands and fathers not done the same? The answer was complicated and painful. Traditional frontier cabin construction had worked adequately for generations. Most winters did not bring storms severe enough to cause catastrophic failures. The blizzard of 1869 was an outlier, the kind of event that could not be predicted or prepared for using conventional wisdom. Except Daniel had prepared for it, not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because he had learned from people who had survived these winters for countless generations, and because his engineering knowledge had given him tools to implement those lessons. After the burial service, Thomas Garrett approached him. His wife Mary stood beside him, her face hollow with grief for their lost neighbors. "We need to talk," Thomas said, "about your dwelling, about how you built it." "Of course," Daniel replied. Over the next week, Daniel received visits from every surviving family in the settlement. Men came with paper and pencils, asking for diagrams and measurements. Women came asking how he had learned such things, whether their husbands could replicate his design. Jacob Mueller sat in on most of these conversations, adding his carpenter's perspective to Daniel's engineering explanations. Daniel shared everything freely: the principles of earth sheltering and thermal mass, the importance of proper drainage to prevent water infiltration, the value of building into landscape rather than imposing structures upon it, the need for southern exposure to capture winter sunlight while earth protected from northern winds. Some men struggled to understand the underlying principles. They wanted simple instructions: dig here, build this, done. But Daniel insisted they understand the why behind each element. If you do not understand the principles, you cannot adapt when circumstances change. You cannot fix problems when they arise. You must understand how earth sheltering works, not just how to build it. Henrik Hansen visited specifically to apologize. I was wrong about your project. I thought you were wasting money and effort. I am sorry. You could not have known, Daniel said. None of us could predict a storm that severe. But you prepared for it anyway. That is the difference between us. By early February, as snow finally began to melt and the settlement started rebuilding, Daniel's role in the community had transformed completely. The outsider who had been mocked for his foolish earth-dwelling had become the authority people consulted about structural design and winter survival. He found himself teaching grown men skills that challenged their assumptions about building and capability. Some accepted his instruction with genuine humility. Others struggled with the reality that someone they had dismissed understood principles they had never considered. But grief and fear proved powerful motivators. The blizzard had killed their neighbors. They would do whatever necessary to prevent similar catastrophes. Thomas Garrett was the first to begin construction of an earth-sheltered dwelling. He started in mid-February, working carefully from Daniel's diagrams and instructions. Daniel visited his property several times to answer questions and verify that implementation matched the structural principles. The drainage channel needs to be deeper, Daniel told him on the second visit, examining Thomas's excavation work. You are in lower ground than I am. More water accumulation potential. Go another 8 inches down and extend it 6 feet further from the structure. Thomas had already spent 2 full days digging his drainage system through frozen ground. 8 more inches and 6 more feet meant hours of additional brutal labor, but he nodded and picked up his pickaxe without complaint. You are right. I will dig deeper. Daniel helped him finish the drainage work, and they spent the afternoon discussing proper stone selection for retaining walls. Thomas listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions that showed he was beginning to understand the underlying engineering rather than just following instructions. By March, 4 families were building earth-sheltered dwellings. By April, it was 7. Some built complete hillside structures like Daniel's. Others created modified versions adapted to their specific terrain. A few built hybrid systems that incorporated earth berming on 3 sides while maintaining conventional construction on the 4th. Jakob Mueller organized informal work parties where men helped each other with the heaviest construction tasks, moving stones, positioning timber beams, excavating difficult soil. Daniel attended these gatherings, offering guidance and answering technical questions. The community's attitude toward indigenous knowledge shifted subtly but unmistakably. If the Ojibwe had known about earth sheltering for generations, what else might they understand about survival that white settlers had dismissed as primitive? It was a dangerous question in a culture built on assumptions of superiority, but the blizzard had cracked something open that would not easily close. John Peterson approached Daniel one afternoon in late April. I want to learn what the Ojibwe taught you, not just about building, about surviving here. Will you teach me? Daniel smiled slightly. Yes, I will teach you. In May of 1869, Daniel received an unexpected visitor, a journalist from Milwaukee named Robert Chandler. He had heard about the settlement's catastrophic blizzard and the young man's remarkable earth-sheltered structure that had survived while conventional cabins collapsed. He wanted to write about it for his newspaper. Daniel was reluctant initially, uncomfortable with publicity. He had not built his dwelling to prove anything to the world, simply to survive. Winter safely using knowledge that made sense to him. But Jacob convinced him that sharing his story more broadly could save lives beyond their immediate community. Other settlements will face severe winters, Jacob argued. Other young people will be alone and vulnerable. Your knowledge should spread. This is not about pride. This is about preventing death. Daniel agreed to the interview. Chandler spent 3 days in the settlement, talking to survivors, examining Daniel's earth-sheltered home, documenting the construction techniques and the principles behind them. He interviewed Thomas Garrett about his own earth shelter project, spoke with Henrik Hansen about changed attitudes, and listened to Jacob explain the engineering sophistication of Daniel's design. His article appeared in the Milwaukee Sentinel on June 7, 1869, under the headline, "Frontier Innovator Survives Killer Blizzard Using Ancient Earth Shelter Design Combined with Modern Engineering." The article brought additional attention. Engineers from Milwaukee and Chicago wrote to Daniel, requesting more detailed specifications. Other frontier communities sent representatives to examine his structure and learn his techniques. A professor from the university requested permission to document his design for architectural students, but the attention also brought resistance. Some settlers, particularly those who had lost family members in the blizzard, struggled with the reality that an outsider's unconventional approach had proven superior to their traditional methods. A few began spreading rumors that Daniel had simply been lucky, that earth shelters would fail eventually, that his design worked only because of unique conditions on his particular hillside. John Peterson defended Daniel publicly at a church gathering. "I visited his home before the blizzard and mocked him for his Indian ideas. I was wrong. His dwelling stood because the engineering was sound, not because of luck." Any of us could have learned what he knew if we had been willing to listen rather than judge. The community remained divided. Most people recognized that Daniel's knowledge had value and sought to learn from him. But a stubborn minority clung to conventional approaches, unwilling to admit that their assumptions about proper building had been fatally flawed. Daniel accepted this reality. He continued sharing his knowledge with anyone genuinely interested, while ignoring those who preferred comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable truth. By autumn of 1869, the settlement had changed dramatically. 8 families now lived in earth-sheltered dwellings. Another 5 were planning construction for the following spring. The landscape that had once featured only conventional log cabins now showed structures that blended into hillsides, working with terrain rather than imposing upon it. Daniel found himself in an unexpected position, teaching not just construction techniques, but a fundamentally different philosophy about how humans could inhabit harsh environments. The Ojibwe lessons his white neighbors had once dismissed as primitive were now recognized as sophisticated environmental wisdom developed over centuries of observation and adaptation. In October, a delegation from a settlement 30 miles north arrived specifically to learn from Daniel. They had heard about the earth shelter designs and wanted to implement similar structures before winter. Daniel spent 2 days with them, explaining principles, drawing diagrams, answering questions about drainage, thermal mass, structural requirements, and proper siting. One of the delegation members, a woman named Catherine Morrison, whose husband had died in a different blizzard years earlier, asked questions that showed unusual understanding of the engineering concepts. "The Earth acts as both insulation and thermal battery," she said, "absorbing heat during day and releasing it slowly at night." "Exactly," Daniel confirmed, pleased to find someone who grasped the principles so quickly. "Most people think of Earth as just protection from weather, but it actively moderates temperature extremes." Catherine smiled. "My father was a mason in Pennsylvania. He taught me about thermal properties of stone and earth. People thought it strange for a girl to learn such things." Over the following months, Catherine became one of Daniel's most effective advocates for earth shelter design. She returned to her settlement and built her own structure, documenting the process carefully and teaching other women the engineering principles involved. Her success challenged assumptions about who could possess and apply technical knowledge. Daniel also developed an unexpected partnership with Thomas Garrett. Thomas had completed his earth-sheltered home in August, and his family had moved in immediately. The structure worked beautifully, staying cool through summer heat and promising warmth through the coming winter. Thomas began working with Daniel to refine and improve the basic design, suggesting modifications based on his own experience. "What if we extended the southern face further?" Thomas proposed one afternoon. "Created more interior space without requiring deeper excavation into the hillside?" They experimented with the concept together, sketching variations, calculating structural requirements. The collaboration produced innovations that improved upon Daniel's original design, demonstrating that knowledge shared multiplied rather than diminished. As winter approached again, the settlement prepared with less fear than the previous year. They had learned hard lessons and adapted accordingly. November of 1869 arrived with familiar cold but unfamiliar confidence. The settlement that had been devastated by the previous winter's blizzard now faced the approaching season with structures designed to withstand whatever nature delivered. 8 earth-sheltered dwellings stood completed, their southern faces visible against hillsides, while the bulk of each structure disappeared into protective earth. Another 3 were partially finished, their owners racing to complete construction before deep snow made work impossible. Daniel watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. His dwelling, once mocked as the foolish project of an inexperienced outsider, had become the template for a new approach to frontier survival. But he also felt the weight of responsibility. If these new structures failed, if his principles proved inadequate in ways he had not anticipated, the consequences would fall on families who had trusted his knowledge. Jakob Muller visited on a cold afternoon in mid-November, bringing bread his wife Anna had baked and staying to share coffee by Daniel's stove. Ash lay near the door, the wolf dog's gray coat thick with winter growth. The 2 men sat in comfortable silence for a time before Jacob spoke. "You worry," Jacob observed. It was statement, not question. "I worry that I have missed something," Daniel admitted. "That some flaw in my design will reveal itself when conditions become severe. These families are trusting their lives to principles I learned from the Ojibwe and engineering my father taught me. What if I am wrong about something critical?" Jacob sipped his coffee, considering. "Your structure survived the worst blizzard in living memory. Thomas Garrett's dwelling is built on the same principles and shows every sign of being equally sound. The others follow the same design. Why do you doubt now?" "Because last winter I risked only myself and Ash. Now I have convinced entire families to build this way. The responsibility feels different." "The responsibility was always there," Jacob said firmly. "Last winter, when your neighbors died in collapsed cabins, you survived because you had knowledge they lacked. You could have kept that knowledge to yourself, protected only your own life. Instead, you shared everything freely. If there is flaw in the design, it would have shown itself by now. You have done good work. Trust it." Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Jacob's words, but still feeling the anxiety that came with changed stakes. His own survival had been one thing. Being responsible for others' survival was something entirely different. The first significant snow came on November 22nd, a moderate storm that dropped 8 inches over 2 days. Daniel monitored his own dwelling's performance carefully, but he also visited each of the completed earth-sheltered homes to check on their occupants and observe how their structures handled the snow load. Thomas Garrett's dwelling performed flawlessly. The earth-covered roof showed no stress, the interior temperature remained stable, and the family reported using significantly less firewood than they had in their previous cabin. Thomas was enthusiastic about the design's effectiveness, pointing out details to Daniel, with the pride of someone who had built something truly functional. "The southern windows capture so much sunlight during the day that we barely need the stove until evening," Thomas explained, "and the earth walls hold that warmth for hours. My wife says she has never been this comfortable during winter." The other completed dwellings showed similar success. Each family reported stable interior temperatures, minimal fuel consumption, and none of the drafts and cold spots that had plagued their conventional cabins. The earth shelter design was working exactly as Daniel had intended, but the real test would come if another severe blizzard struck. The previous winter's catastrophic storm had been exceptional in its intensity and duration. If similar conditions returned, would these new structures truly protect their occupants, or had Daniel's confidence been based on a single successful example? December brought a pattern of moderate snowfalls, interspersed with clear, brutally cold days. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero on several occasions. Daniel noticed something interesting during these cold snaps. While conventional cabins required constant fire to maintain livable temperatures, the earth-sheltered dwellings stayed comfortable with minimal heating. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth moderated temperature extremes naturally. John Peterson, who had completed his earth shelter in late October, stopped by Daniel's home during one of these cold periods. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression serious. "Last winter, during the blizzard, I lay in my cabin listening to the roof beams groan and thinking we were all going to die. I was terrified, and I was angry at you." Daniel raised his eyebrows. "Angry at me? Why?" "Because you had built something different, something that challenged how we thought things should be done, and I had mocked you for it. When I heard those beams groaning, I realized that my pride and my certainty about proper building methods might kill my family. I was angry at you for being right when I had been so sure you were wrong." Peterson paused, gathering his thoughts. "This winter, when the temperature drops like this, I sit in my warm home and feel grateful. Grateful that you were stubborn enough to ignore our mockery. Grateful that you shared your knowledge instead of letting us continue in our dangerous ignorance. I wanted you to know that." Daniel felt unexpected emotion at Peterson's words. "I am glad your family is safe and comfortable. That is all I wanted when I started teaching people about earth sheltering." "It is more than comfort and safety," Peterson said. "You changed how we think about living in this place. You showed us that the land itself could be our ally rather than something we fight against. That is a profound shift." As December progressed toward the year's end, the settlement prepared for whatever winter might bring. They prepared with knowledge rather than just hope, with structures engineered to work with natural forces rather than simply resist them. The transformation Daniel had initiated was becoming permanent, changing not just how people built, but how they understood their relationship with the harsh Wisconsin landscape. On New Year's Eve, the community gathered at the church for a modest celebration. The mood was markedly different from the previous year's gathering, which had been shadowed by recent tragedy and uncertain future. This year, people spoke with confidence about surviving winter, about expanding their earth shelter designs, about teaching these principles to new settlers who would arrive in spring. Daniel stood somewhat apart from the main gathering, Ash beside him, as always, watching families laugh and share food. Jacob approached with 2 cups of hot cider, offering one to Daniel. "You have given them something important," Jacob said quietly. "Not just better buildings. You have given them confidence that they can survive here, that they can adapt and learn and change. That is worth more than any structure." Daniel accepted the cider gratefully. "I just shared what I knew, what the Ojibwe taught me, what my father taught me. I combined knowledge from different sources and applied it to a specific problem." "That is what innovation is," Jacob replied. "Taking wisdom from multiple places, combining it in new ways, solving problems that conventional thinking cannot address. You did that, and you did it well." As midnight approached and the settlement welcomed 1870, Daniel allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. The second winter was proving his principles sound. The structures were performing as designed. The families who had trusted his knowledge were safe and comfortable. Perhaps Jacob was right. Perhaps he could trust the work he had done. Spring arrived slowly in Wisconsin, advancing and retreating like an uncertain visitor before finally establishing dominance over winter's grip. By late March of 1870, enough snow had melted for the settlement to properly assess how their various structures had survived the season. The results proved illuminating in ways that extended beyond simple survival statistics. Daniel spent early April visiting each earth-sheltered dwelling, documenting performance, and noting any issues that had emerged during winter months. He brought paper and pencils, carefully recording details that might inform future improvements. Ash accompanied him as always, the wolf dog enjoying the warmer weather and increased freedom to roam. At Thomas Garrett's home, Daniel found the family preparing their garden plot in the protected space on the southern side of their dwelling. Mary Garrett was particularly enthusiastic about showing Daniel something unexpected. "Look at this," she said, gesturing to the earth-covered roof of their home. The sod they had transplanted months earlier had not only survived, but thrived. Thick grass grew across the entire surface, interspersed with wildflowers that had seeded themselves naturally. "We have a living roof. In summer, this will provide even more insulation, and the roots will help hold the soil in place." Daniel had anticipated this benefit theoretically, but seeing it realized so beautifully pleased him immensely. The Ojibwe told me that sod roofs improve with age, as the plant roots create a mat that prevents erosion. Your roof will actually become more stable over time. Thomas joined them, wiping dirt from his hands. "I want to show you something else," he said, leading Daniel around to the western side of the dwelling. "We noticed during winter that snow melting off the hillside was creating small drainage issues here. Not flooding, just dampness. I think we need to extend the drainage channel another 8 feet and deepen it by 6 inches. What do you think?" Daniel examined the area carefully, noting the subtle signs of water movement Thomas had identified. "You are absolutely right. The spring melt reveals drainage patterns that are not visible during other seasons. Extending and deepening the channel here will solve the problem permanently." They spent an hour discussing the modification, with Thomas sketching his proposed solution and Daniel suggesting minor adjustments based on grade and water flow principles. The conversation demonstrated something Daniel found deeply satisfying. Thomas had not just followed instructions to build an earth shelter, he had genuinely understood the underlying principles and could now diagnose and solve problems independently. At John Peterson's dwelling, Daniel encountered a different kind of success. Peterson had built his structure with 4 children in mind, creating a larger interior space than Daniel's original design. The excavation had required significantly more labor, but the result was impressive: a spacious home that felt open despite being partially underground. "The children love it," Peterson explained as they toured the interior. "They call it their cave house, but they mean it affectionately. And my eldest daughter, who is 15, has been asking me to teach her the mathematics you used for calculating roof load and support beam sizing. She wants to understand how the structure works." Daniel felt a spark of excitement at this news. "I would be happy to teach her if you approve. The principles are not difficult once you understand basic mathematics and physics." Peterson hesitated, clearly torn between conventional thinking about appropriate education for daughters and the reality that such knowledge had proven literally life-saving. "My wife worries that learning such things will make her unmarriageable. Men do not want wives who know more than they do about building and engineering. Men who are threatened by knowledgeable women are not worth marrying," Daniel said bluntly. "Your daughter's mind is a gift. Educating it fully makes her more capable, not less. Desirable. And in frontier conditions, practical knowledge can mean the difference between survival and death. Would you rather she be ignorant and marriageable, or educated and alive?" Peterson laughed at Daniel's directness. "When you put it that way, the choice seems obvious. Very well. If she wishes to learn, you may teach her." Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself instructing not just Peterson's daughter, but several other young people who were curious about the engineering principles behind earth shelter design. He held informal classes at his own dwelling, teaching basic mathematics, explaining load distribution and thermal mass, demonstrating how to calculate proper dimensions for different soil types and terrain conditions. Among his students was Sarah Garrett, Thomas and Mary's 12-year-old daughter, who showed remarkable aptitude for mathematical thinking. She grasped concepts quickly and asked questions that revealed genuine understanding rather than rote. Memorization. Daniel recognized in her the same kind of mind his father had valued: quick, analytical, eager to understand not just how things worked, but why they worked that way. Why does earth provide better insulation than wood? Sarah asked during one session. Density and thermal mass, Daniel explained. Wood is relatively light and porous, which means it cannot store much heat. Earth is dense and heavy, which means it can absorb large amounts of thermal energy and release it slowly over time. Think of it like the difference between a thin blanket and a heavy quilt. Both provide some warmth, but the heavier covering holds heat much more effectively. Sarah nodded, making notes in the small journal she had started keeping. So the earth walls are like a battery for heat, storing it during warm periods and releasing it during cold periods. Exactly. That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The spring also brought visitors from other settlements who had heard about the earth shelter designs and wanted to learn. Daniel found himself hosting delegations from communities 50 and even 80 miles away, all seeking knowledge that might help them survive future harsh winters. One group came from a settlement that had lost nearly a quarter of its population during the previous winter's blizzards. Their leader, a grim-faced man named William Crawford, examined Daniel's dwelling with intense focus. "We cannot afford another winter like the last one," Crawford said bluntly. "We need to build differently, but our people are conservative. They resist change. How did you convince your community to adopt such unusual construction methods?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I did not convince them through argument. I convinced them through example. My structure survived when conventional cabins collapsed. That single demonstration was more persuasive than any words could have been. Build one earth shelter that works, and others will follow. Try to convince people through theory alone, and you will face endless resistance." Crawford nodded slowly. "So you are saying I should build my own home this way and let the results speak for themselves?" "That is exactly what I am saying. And make sure your design is sound, because if it fails, you will confirm every skeptic's assumption that earth sheltering does not work." The pressure of that responsibility weighed on Daniel as more communities sought his guidance. Each structure built based on his principles represented a test of the knowledge he had synthesized from Ojibwe wisdom and engineering science. Success would save lives. Failure would kill people and discredit an approach that Daniel knew was fundamentally sound. By late April, Daniel had provided detailed plans and instruction to representatives from 7 different settlements. He had trained over 20 individuals in the basic principles of earth shelter design. He had corrected misconceptions, warned against common mistakes, and emphasized the importance of proper drainage, adequate structural support, and correct siting for solar exposure. Jakob Mueller observed this expanding influence with a mixture of pride and concern. "You are becoming famous," he told Daniel one evening. "People travel days to seek your advice. Your knowledge is spreading across the territory, but you need to be careful. Fame brings complications." "What complications?" Daniel asked, genuinely puzzled. "Jealousy? Resentment? People who will question your authority or claim they invented these methods. People who will build poorly and blame you when their structures fail. Fame is not simple blessing." Daniel had not considered these possibilities, but he recognized the wisdom in Jacob's warning. Already he had encountered a few individuals who seemed more interested in taking credit for earth shelter innovations than in actually learning the principles correctly. The settlement's original mockery of his dwelling had transformed into widespread acceptance. But that acceptance came with new challenges. As spring progressed toward summer, Daniel found himself at a crossroads. He could continue teaching and spreading earth shelter knowledge, accepting the complications that Jacob had warned about, or he could retreat to the simple life he had originally envisioned, farming his land, living quietly in his hillside home, minimizing contact with the broader community. The decision was complicated by something unexpected. He had grown to enjoy teaching. Watching students grasp engineering concepts, seeing families succeed with structures they had built based on his guidance, knowing that his knowledge was actively saving lives across multiple communities. These satisfactions were deep and meaningful in ways that solitary survival could never match. Summer of 1870 brought heat that tested earth shelter designs in ways winter never had. Daniel discovered that structures optimized for surviving. Brutal cold also needed to manage opposite extreme temperatures. The solutions required adaptation and learning, demonstrating that effective design was an iterative process rather than a single perfect answer. The first hot spell arrived in mid-June, with temperatures climbing above 90 degrees for 5 consecutive days. Daniel noticed immediately that his dwelling remained remarkably cool. While neighbors in conventional cabins suffered through oppressive heat, his earth-sheltered home maintained comfortable temperatures in the mid-60s without any cooling mechanisms beyond opening windows at night and closing them during peak heat hours. The thermal mass that protected against winter cold now worked in reverse. The earth surrounding and covering his dwelling remained at stable underground temperatures, effectively insulating the interior from summer heat. Air flowing through his southern windows at night cooled the structure, and the earth absorbed that coolness and released it slowly throughout the following day, but not all the new earth shelters performed equally well in heat. John Peterson discovered that his larger dwelling, which had more interior space and therefore more air volume to cool, became uncomfortably warm during the afternoon unless he implemented active ventilation strategies. He visited Daniel seeking solutions. "The structure is wonderful in winter, but becomes a hotbox by mid-afternoon in this heat," Peterson explained. "My children complain constantly. What am I doing wrong?" Daniel visited Peterson's dwelling and quickly identified the issue. "You have adequate southern exposure for winter solar gain, but you lack sufficient cross-ventilation for summer cooling. You need to add ventilation openings high on your northern wall near the ceiling. Hot air rises, and if you give it an exit path, it will create natural airflow. Cool air enters through your southern windows, warms and rises, then exits through high northern vents, pulling more cool air through." They implemented this modification over 3 days, carefully cutting openings through the northern earth wall and installing screened vents that could be closed during winter. The results were immediate and dramatic. Peterson's dwelling cooled noticeably, and the constant airflow made it comfortable even during the hottest afternoons. Daniel documented this issue and solution carefully, recognizing that it represented important refinement of the basic earth shelter design. He shared the information with everyone who had built or was planning to build, emphasizing that structures needed to work effectively across all seasons, not just winter. The summer also revealed another challenge: moisture management. Several earth shelter builders reported problems with condensation forming on interior stone walls during humid weather. The cool earth walls met warm, moisture-laden summer air and created conditions where water condensed on surfaces, potentially leading to mold growth or structural issues. Thomas Garrett experienced this problem significantly. His family noticed moisture appearing on the western wall during particularly humid periods. Thomas contacted Daniel immediately, concerned that the dampness indicated fundamental design flaws. Daniel examined the situation carefully, measuring humidity levels, checking drainage systems, and inspecting the stone wall construction. "This is not a structural failure," he explained. "This is a natural consequence of cool surfaces meeting humid air. We need to manage airflow to reduce humidity inside the dwelling and potentially add a lime wash to your interior walls that will help manage moisture." They implemented several solutions, improving ventilation, adding moisture-absorbing materials in strategic locations, and applying lime wash that helped regulate humidity. Within 2 weeks, the condensation problem had resolved completely. But the incident taught Daniel an important lesson: earth shelter. Design was more complex than simply digging into hillsides and covering structures with soil. Effective implementation required understanding seasonal variations, managing moisture in all its forms, and adapting to specific local conditions that might not be obvious during initial construction. He began documenting these lessons systematically, creating detailed written guides that addressed not just basic construction, but also troubleshooting common issues and adapting designs for different climates and conditions. His notes grew into a comprehensive manual that covered everything from initial site selection through seasonal management strategies. Catherine Morrison, the woman from the northern settlement who had shown strong understanding of thermal principles, visited Daniel in July specifically to discuss moisture management. Her settlement had high water tables and significant humidity, making earth shelter construction challenging. "We want to build this way, but our soil conditions are different from yours," Catherine explained. "More clay, more water retention, more flooding risk during spring melt. How do we adapt your design for our specific conditions?" Daniel spent 3 days working with Catherine, teaching her how to assess soil drainage characteristics, how to modify foundation designs for high water tables, and how to create more extensive drainage systems that could handle greater water volumes. Catherine was an exceptionally quick learner, grasping complex engineering concepts and immediately seeing applications for her specific situation. "You should document this," Catherine told him, "not just for me, but for everyone who wants to build earth shelters in challenging conditions. Your knowledge is too valuable to remain only in your head." Daniel recognized the truth in her words. He had been sharing knowledge verbally, teaching individuals and small groups, but that approach limited how widely the information could spread. Written documentation would allow people he would never meet to benefit from lessons he had learned. He began writing seriously that summer, spending evenings after farm work documenting everything he knew about earth shelter design. The process was slow and meticulous. He wrote clearly and precisely, assuming readers would have minimal technical background but strong motivation to learn. He included diagrams sketched carefully to show critical details. He explained not just how to build, but why specific techniques worked, believing that understanding principles was more valuable than memorizing instructions. Jakob Mueller read Daniel's emerging manuscript and offered unexpected praise. "This is important work. You are creating something that will outlast any single structure. Knowledge preserved in writing can spread farther and last longer than knowledge shared only through speech." By late summer, Daniel had produced a draft manuscript of nearly 80 pages covering site selection, excavation techniques, drainage design, structural requirements, seasonal management, and troubleshooting common problems. The document represented a comprehensive guide to earth shelter construction based on Ojibwe wisdom combined with engineering principles and refined through practical experience. Catherine Morrison offered to help edit and expand the manuscript, adding sections based on her experience, adapting the designs for different soil conditions. Together they created a more robust document that addressed variations in climate, terrain, and available materials. In August, Daniel showed the manuscript to Henrik Hansen, who had transformed from skeptic to supporter after witnessing earth shelters survive the previous winter. Henrik read it carefully, his expression thoughtful. "This should be published," Henrik said finally, "not just copied by hand and shared locally. This should be printed and distributed widely. There are publishers in Milwaukee who handle technical manuals. I know someone who could help you connect with them." Daniel had not considered formal publication. The idea seemed presumptuous. Who was he to publish technical manuals? He was just a 24-year-old homesteader who had combined knowledge from different sources. But Henrik's argument was persuasive. "People are dying in winter storms across the entire frontier," Henrik said bluntly. "Your knowledge could prevent those deaths. Keeping it local, sharing it only with people who happen to hear about you, that is wasteful. You have a responsibility to spread this information as widely as possible." The word responsibility struck Daniel forcefully. He had felt responsible for the families in his immediate settlement who had built based on his guidance. But Henrik was suggesting a broader responsibility to people he would never meet, in places he would never visit, who faced similar survival challenges. That responsibility felt heavy, but Daniel could not deny its validity. If his knowledge could save lives, and if publication would spread that knowledge more effectively than personal teaching, then publication was the ethical choice regardless of his personal comfort with visibility. By September, Daniel had committed to pursuing publication. Henrik connected him with a technical publisher in Milwaukee who specialized in agricultural and construction manuals. The publisher, a pragmatic man named George Hendricks, reviewed Daniel's manuscript and immediately recognized its value. Frontier building guides are popular, but they are mostly conventional wisdom repeated endlessly, Hendricks explained during their meeting in Milwaukee. This is genuinely innovative, earth shelter construction combined with clear engineering principles and practical troubleshooting advice. This will sell well, and more importantly, it will save lives. I want to publish this. The winter of 1870 to 1871 proved anticlimactic in the best possible way. No catastrophic blizzard struck, no roofs collapsed. The settlement's earth-sheltered dwellings performed exactly as designed, keeping families warm and safe through months of sustained cold, without the fear and fuel consumption that had characterized previous winters. Daniel spent much of that winter working with George Hendricks on finalizing his manuscript for publication. The process involved more work than Daniel had anticipated. Hendricks wanted additional diagrams, clearer explanations of complex concepts, and expanded sections addressing variations in climate and terrain. Catherine Morrison contributed extensively, writing supplementary chapters based on her experience adapting earth shelter designs for high water table conditions. The book, tentatively titled Earth-Sheltered Construction for Frontier Homesteads, combining indigenous wisdom with engineering principles, was scheduled for publication in spring of 1871. Hendricks predicted strong sales, based on growing interest in innovative building techniques that could improve frontier survival rates. But publication brought unexpected complications. In February, Daniel received a letter from a man named Marcus Whitfield, who claimed to be an architect from Chicago. Whitfield's letter was professionally worded, but fundamentally hostile. "I understand you are publishing a manual on earth shelter construction," Whitfield wrote. "I must inform you that I have been researching and developing similar techniques for several years. Your publication without acknowledging prior work in this field constitutes intellectual appropriation. I expect proper attribution in your manuscript, or I will pursue legal remedies." Daniel showed the letter to Jacob, confused and concerned. "I have never heard of Marcus Whitfield. I learned earth shelter principles from the Ojibwe and from my father's engineering knowledge. I developed these specific designs through my own work. How can this man claim I appropriated his research?" Jacob read the letter carefully, his expression darkening. "This is what I warned you about. Fame brings people who want to claim your success. This man probably read newspaper articles about your work and now wants to attach himself to your reputation. Do not let him intimidate you." Daniel consulted with George Hendricks, who was more familiar with such disputes. Hendricks investigated Whitfield's claims and discovered that the Chicago architect had indeed written a few brief articles about theoretical earth shelter designs, but his work was purely academic with no practical implementation or successful structures. Moreover, his designs bore little resemblance to Daniel's Ojibwe-influenced approach. "Whitfield is attempting to claim credit for work he did not do," Hendricks explained. "His theoretical writings predate your construction, but theory without successful practice is worthless. Your book clearly acknowledges that earth shelter techniques have indigenous origins and have been used by various cultures for centuries. That is sufficient attribution. Whitfield has no legitimate claim." Despite Hendricks's reassurance, the incident troubled Daniel. He had shared his knowledge freely, never seeking personal glory or financial gain beyond modest book royalties. The idea that others might try to exploit or claim his work felt deeply wrong. The situation resolved when Catherine Morrison, who had connections in Chicago through her family, investigated Whitfield more thoroughly. She discovered that he was known in architectural circles as someone who frequently threatened legal action against anyone working in fields he considered his territory, but who rarely followed through because his claims lacked substance. "Ignore him," Catherine advised. "He is what my father called a paper tiger. Lots of threatening noise, no actual danger. Your work is original and properly attributed. Whitfield cannot prove otherwise." Daniel's book was published on April 15, 1871, with a print run of 1,000 copies. George Hendricks had initially worried that was too ambitious, but advance orders from frontier settlements, agricultural organizations, and even some university libraries exceeded 500 copies before publication day. The book's impact was immediate and significant. Settlements across Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakota territories ordered copies. Frontier families used it as a construction guide. A few progressive universities added it to their engineering curriculum as an example of practical problem-solving, combining traditional knowledge with modern science. Reviews in frontier newspapers were overwhelmingly positive. The Milwaukee Sentinel called it an essential guide for anyone serious about frontier survival. A Minnesota newspaper described it as proof that wisdom can come from unexpected sources when we are willing to listen and learn. But the most meaningful feedback came in letters from readers who had used the book to build their own earth-sheltered homes. A widow from Minnesota wrote that the design had allowed her to remain on her homestead independently rather than returning east. A young couple in the Dakota territories reported surviving a severe early winter storm in their earth shelter, built following Daniel's instructions, while neighbors in conventional cabins had been forced to evacuate. These letters confirmed for Daniel that publication had been the right choice. His knowledge was reaching people he would never meet, saving lives in places he would never visit, spreading understanding about how to live sustainably in harsh environments. The book's success also brought speaking invitations. Agricultural societies wanted Daniel to present at their meetings. Universities requested guest lectures. Frontier aid organizations asked him to train their volunteers in earth shelter construction principles. Daniel accepted some invitations and declined others, trying to balance his desire to spread knowledge with his preference for quiet life on his homestead. He traveled to Milwaukee twice to speak at university engineering departments. He presented at a large agricultural conference in Madison, where over 200 attendees listened to his lecture on thermal mass and passive solar design. These speaking engagements were professionally successful, but personally exhausting for someone who preferred working with his hands to talking about his work. Daniel found himself longing for the simple routine of his farm, for quiet evenings with Ash, for the satisfaction of physical labor rather than verbal explanation.